The Queen Who Remembers. After the court presentation, the ship changed its posture around Jonah. Not openly. The Umbralith was too disciplined for that. It did not gossip where outsiders could hear it, did not stare where rank forbade it, did not lurch into obvious fascination the way a station or colony crew might have. But the change was there all the same, in the subtle mechanics of attention. Doors opened for him now without delay. Servants bowed not with confusion, but with precise acknowledgement. Officers who had once regarded him as a political inconvenience now looked at the Order of the Veiled Star on his chest and recalculated his existence with visible discomfort. It was, Jonah decided, deeply unnatural to become significant because one had almost died correctly. He said as much to Kalis on the third day after the ceremony, while she was trying to teach him how not to disgrace himself in the event of future hand-to-hand engagement. They were in a private training chamber tucked deep inside one of the ship's inner martial rings, the sort of place clearly designed by people who considered violence a craft with aesthetic obligations. The floor was dark, slightly resilient stone. The walls held inactive weapon racks behind seamless panels. Silver sigils pulsed softly at ankle height, marking boundary lines. Jonah suspected mattered more than anyone was currently explaining. Kalis knocked his legs out from under him for the fourth time in under 10 minutes. Jonah hit the mat with a curse, rolled to one elbow, and glared up at her. "This," he said, breathing hard, "feels less like instruction and more like personal opinion." Kalis stood above him, elegant and pitiless, dressed in stripped-down training blacks, with her silver hair braided high and tight away from her face. "My personal opinion," she said, "is that if a human insists on surviving historical significance, he ought to learn how not to be folded by the first competent attacker who dislikes symbolism." Jonah stayed where he was. Mostly because getting up too quickly now risked several systems filing formal protest. "I don't know," he muttered. "Becoming important because you threw yourself in front of a child seems like a design flaw in society." Kalis held out a hand. He took it. She hauled him upright with infuriating ease. "Importance," she said, circling him again, "is usually a design flaw in society. But that does not make it less real." Jonah reset his stance as she had shown him, badly in her view, but less badly than on previous days. "Remind me why we couldn't just go with the original plan of me fixing engines quietly until I die old and unnoticed." Kalis's silver eyes flashed. "Because you stood still in a marketplace." That ended the argument, as it always did. Jonah exhaled, shifted his weight, and prepared for her next attack. It never came. Instead, the chamber door opened with a low chime. Nicera entered first. One glance taking in the position of Jonah's feet, Kalis's lifted brow, the sweat darkening the back of Jonah's training shirt, the general state of things. She found them apparently survivable and stepped aside. Behind her came a household attendant in formal black, head bowed. "The High Matriarch requests audience," the attendant said. The chamber went still. Jonah straightened too fast and immediately regretted it. "With me?" he asked, before remembering how absurd the question sounded in context. Kalis, to her credit, did not mock him. "Unless the High Matriarch has taken a late interest in your footwork," she said, "yes." Nicera dismissed the attendant with a nod. The door sealed. Silence held for one beat longer. Then Kalis looked at Jonah. "Well," she said, "this is either extremely good or extremely dangerous." "Those are the same thing on this ship," Jonah muttered. "Correct." Nicera crossed the chamber toward him. "There was no public notice of this summons," she said. "No herald, no court channel, house private only." That sounded important in ways Jonah did not yet understand. Maven, who had apparently been watching part of the session from the threshold, and now finally entered carrying 3 data slates and a patience level Jonah had long since ceased trying to gauge, said, "Which means it is not political theater." Jonah wiped the back of his arm across his forehead. "That's supposed to be comforting?" "No," Maven said. "It is supposed to be accurate." Nicera was already evaluating logistics. "You will change. House private attire, not court formal. No insignia except the ward band and veiled star. You will be escorted, but not by full procession." Kalis folded her arms. "And you will not speak first unless spoken to." Jonah looked at her. "That sounds ominously specific. It is one of your weaker skills." "Also true." Maven adjusted one of the slates against her hip and finally looked fully at him. "Do not mistake privacy for informality. Private audiences can be more consequential than public ones. There are fewer witnesses and more truth." Jonah absorbed that. Truth. It was a dangerous word in the world Elira ruled. Dangerous because he had begun to suspect it mattered to her far more than it did to most sovereigns, and because that concern itself had costs. "Why now?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Then Nicera said, "Because she has decided something." That did not help. But it rang true enough that Jonah stopped asking. The room to which they brought him was not a throne chamber. Not a strategy hall either, though maps lived there. Not quite a library, though books stood in dark shelves from floor to ceiling along two of its walls. If the garden had revealed Elira's interior tenderness and the court her public force, this room felt like the place where both were made to negotiate with one another. A private council chamber, perhaps, though stripped of all performance. The ceiling arched high overhead in black wood and silver stone. No windows opened to space, but a long wall of dark crystal reflected a slow-moving field of stars from some external projection system, so that the room seemed lit by distant heavens without ever surrendering itself to them. A fire, not flame exactly, but a contained band of pale radiance, burned along a recessed channel in the far wall. Several tables stood around the room bearing objects Jonah recognized and did not. Ancient texts in sealed cases, tactical projections frozen in blue-white light, a half-disassembled ceremonial blade, bowls of black glass filled with silver sand or dried leaves or small pale stones. Elira Valathorn stood at the center of it all with one hand resting on the edge of a long table. No crown, no court, no audience, but him. She wore a dark gown simpler than her ceremonial attire, but no less severe, the fabric falling in clean lines from throat to floor. Her hair was only partly bound this time, and without the full architecture of court around her, she seemed, if not smaller, never that, less mythic and more dangerous in a different way. Humanly legible, which was perhaps more dangerous than myth. Nicera, Kalis, and Maven escorted Jonah to the threshold and stopped. "The audience is private," Elira said before any of them could speak. "Remain outside." All three bowed at once. None of them looked thrilled. Jonah tried not to share the feeling too visibly. The doors sealed behind him. He stood alone with the ruler of the Umbralith sovereignty. Elira did not immediately speak. Instead, she regarded him with that familiar golden steadiness, as if checking whether the version of him that had survived the court was still the same man who had entered the market on Bastion Reach without permission from history. At last, she said, "How many times has Lieutenant Kalis put you on the floor today?" Jonah blinked. That was not where he had expected this audience to begin. "4," he admitted. Then, after a pause, "Possibly 5. One of them happened so fast I'm not sure it should count separately." Something shifted at the corner of Elira's mouth. A generous self-assessment, high praise coming from a sovereign. It was not praise. "I'll treasure it anyway." Now, she did smile, small, fleeting, enough to alter the room. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward a low chair opposite the long table. Jonah obeyed, trying not to wince as he lowered himself. Elira did not take the chair across from him. Instead, she remained standing for another few moments, looking not at him but at the objects on the table. At length, she took up a dark metal cup, poured something from a slender black decanter into a second one, and set it before him. Jonah eyed the liquid. "This is where I ask whether I should be concerned. It is tea." That has not always narrowed the field helpfully. "Drink it," she said. "If I wished you dead, I would not do it with herbs." Jonah picked up the cup. It smelled nothing like any tea he knew. Earthy, bitter, touched with wintergreen and smoke. He took a cautious sip. Warmth moved through his chest almost immediately, not intoxicating, not medicinal exactly, but stabilizing in a way he had begun to recognize as one of the many infuriatingly effective Valdir domestic arts. "Good," Elira said, still not sitting. "Now you will listen more effectively." Jonah lowered the cup. You sound like Nicera. She sounds like me. That, he thought, was probably true enough to be frightening. At last, Elira took the chair opposite him. For a few moments there was only the quiet sound of distant ship systems, the soft burn of wall light, the movement of stars across black crystal. Then she said, "You have questions." It was not framed as generosity, more like a tactical inevitability. "Yes. Begin." Jonah considered pretending he needed time to order them. That would have been pointless, so he chose the one that had been pressing against his thoughts since the court. "In public," he said, "you defended me because the law required recognition." Elira's gaze held. "Yes." "In private," he continued, "I'm not convinced that's the whole reason." Not offended silence. Measured silence. At last, Elira set down her cup. "It is not." Jonah let that settle. She did not elaborate. Apparently, he would have to earn the rest. "Then why?" he asked. Elira turned her head slightly toward the wall of stars. "When rulers speak of moral action," she said, "they are almost always lying in one of two directions. Either they are dressing self-interest in noble language, or they are mistaking feeling for governance." Jonah leaned back slightly, careful of his ribs. "You don't strike me as someone who confuses those." "No," she said. "I do not." There was no vanity in it, just fact. She rose again, restless now, and began to walk slowly along the far side of the table, fingertips grazing its edge. "The difficulty," she said, "is that governance without morality becomes management of appetite. Efficient, durable, often praised." She glanced at him, "and monstrous." Jonah watched her carefully. The room had changed, not in its light or shape, in its truth. In court, she had spoken as sovereign. In the garden, as ruler revealing one vein of conviction. Here, alone, she spoke as someone willing to name the rot beneath power because there was no audience left to seduce. "You asked in the garden whether this place exists so my people do not lose themselves," she said. "I remember." "It does." She stopped beside the wall of stars. "When I was younger than your daughter is now," she said, "I learned what fear does to the civilized." Jonah went still. The line was not theatrically delivered. It carried none of the elevated music of formal confession. That made it hit harder. Elira did not look at him as she spoke. "Fear simplifies," she said. "It convinces the frightened that cruelty is practicality, that distance is safety, that if suffering can be contained to another body, another village, another species, then one may still call oneself good." Jonah's hand tightened around the warm cup. "Village." The word came and went so quickly, he almost thought he'd imagined it. Elira continued, still facing the stars. "I have seen empires justify horrors by naming them temporary necessities. I have watched noble houses preserve themselves by turning children into leverage. I have watched hunger dress itself as purity and call that vision holy." Now she turned. "And I have done what rule required to survive among such things." The room went very quiet. Jonah looked at her. Really looked. At the old scars at her temple. At the line of her mouth held too carefully still. At the terrible control in her posture. Not because she lacked feeling, but because feeling too long undisciplined had probably once threatened to ruin her. He understood then, at least in outline, that Elira's morality was not innocence preserved. It was memory weaponized against corruption. "Jonah Mercer," she said, "when you stood for Elson, you reminded me of something I have spent 2,000 years refusing to surrender. The number was impossible every time, even in thought. 2,000 years. He could not conceive of carrying one conviction intact across that much darkness." "What?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze then, and the force of it made him feel as though the room had narrowed to a single line between them. "That weakness," she said, "does not erase dignity." He said nothing. Because what answer existed to that? Because somewhere in the sentence lived a history he had not been invited fully into. Because suddenly, absurdly, he thought of Ava at 5 years old, staring up at him while he explained promises he would not keep. He thought of Bastian Reach, of years spent shrinking himself to fit failure, of how easy it had become to mistake weakness for worthlessness. Elira saw the thought move through him. "You understand?" she said. It was not a question. Jonah stared down into the dark tea for a moment before answering. I understand enough to know why someone would fight not to forget that. Elira's expression changed. Not visibly to most observers, perhaps, but he saw it now. The slightest yielding, the recognition of being met rather than merely heard. She came back to the table, but did not sit. Instead, she leaned one hand against its surface and said, "Do you know why the Ashen Creed hates alliance with humanity beyond the obvious? The obvious being prejudice, blood politics, and a theological attachment to being awful?" At that, her mouth almost betrayed her again. "Concise," she said, "but yes." Jonah lifted one shoulder, then regretted it. "I have been educated by experts." Elira ignored the line with the dignity of long practice. "They hate humanity," she said, "because humans mirror a beginning they prefer erased." Jonah frowned. "The Valdir were not born sovereign. We were made through war, plague, predation, adaptation, desperation. History chooses different language depending on who writes it. But in all versions, one truth remains. We emerged from vulnerability, not transcendence." She spoke the sentence like doctrine. And perhaps it was. "The Ashen Creed cannot tolerate that truth," she continued. "They need superiority to be innate, not chosen, eternal, not ethical. They call mercy contamination because mercy requires remembering the body's old humiliations, hunger, fear, need, grief. They would rather reign as perfected beasts than govern as disciplined inheritors of pain." Jonah sat back and let the thought unfold. "So humanity threatens them," he said slowly, "because you remind them they came from weakness too." Elira nodded once. "And because the existence of conscience in another species denies their lie that cruelty is strength." Something in Jonah tightened then, not fear, but recognition sharpened into anger. "Then the problem isn't just that I saved Elson," he said. "It's that I did it for the wrong reason, from their perspective." "Correct, because if I'd acted for status or treaty or gain, they could dismiss it." "Yes. But acting because a child was afraid reveals their doctrine as spiritually malformed," Elira said. The word spiritually hung in the room. Not religious exactly, deeper, broader, concerned with the shape of the soul rather than the categories of law. Jonah took another sip of the bitter tea, mostly to buy time. When he set the cup down again, he asked the question that had been forming since the garden, though he had not realized until now that it was the question he most wanted answered. "How do you do it?" Elira looked at him. "Do what?" "Remember without drowning in it." Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that arrives when a conversation crosses from significance into danger. Elira straightened very slowly. "I do not," she said. Jonah felt the answer in his chest, not because it was dramatic, because it was true enough to leave no shelter. She moved away from the table again, this time toward a narrow shelf inset into the wall near the fire channel. Several objects rested there, too far for him to make them out clearly from where he sat. She touched none of them, but stood before them like one does before graves one visits often enough to know each stone by hand. "The cost of memory," she said, "is that it remains active. It does not become background merely because it is old. Age preserves some wounds by deepening their channels." She turned her head slightly, profile lit by the pale wall fire. "There are nights when I remember with perfect clarity what smoke smells like when it carries the house you were born in." The room seemed to shrink around the sentence. Jonah did not move, did not breathe too loudly. Now, finally, he understood that the fragments he had glimpsed around her were not abstractions, not symbolic poses adopted by a philosophical queen. They were injuries, ancient, yes, still living, and she was showing him just enough of them to make trust possible without making spectacle of pain. "Then why keep remembering?" he asked. Elira answered at once, because forgetting would make cruelty feel efficient. There it was again. The heart of her, not tenderness alone, not guilt, not nostalgia, moral resistance, memory as a governing discipline. She came back at last and stood before him, not behind the protection of the table now, but nearer. "When I first took the throne," she said, "many urged me to simplify, to purge weaker houses, to rule by terror where persuasion slowed things, to treat human settlements as resource points, not treaty partners. They said survival required clarity." Her eyes hardened. What they meant was that power preferred not to remember faces. Jonah felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the room. And you refused. I did, she said. Not because refusal was easier, because I knew exactly what kind of ruler forgetting would produce. The implication hovered there, a ruler she might have become, one she perhaps had already, in moments, touched and recoiled from. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Then, carefully, he said, in court, you called blood without conscience appetite with pedigree. Yes, that didn't sound improvised. Then Elira did something he was beginning to realize was rarer than court honor. She laughed, very softly, very briefly. No, she said, it did not. He smiled despite himself. Good. Why good? Because I'd hate to think I'm entangled in galactic politics run entirely on instinct. You are, she said. I simply try not to let that remain visible. Now the smile stayed at the edge of her mouth longer. Jonah looked at her, and, for one unguarded moment, no longer saw only sovereign or immortal or ruler of a feared kingdom. He saw a woman who had built an empire around not becoming what history had every reason to turn her into. That, he thought, was a much harder kind of greatness than conquest. Elira's gaze sharpened slightly, as if she could feel the direction of his thoughts, even if not their exact wording. You are wondering, she said, why I tell you any of this. Jonah hesitated. Was I that obvious? Yes. All right. He lifted his hands a little. Why? She regarded him for a long moment before answering. Because you have already been made symbol enough by others, she said. I would not have you mistake my interest for mere use. The words landed with the strange force of being both gift and warning. Jonah felt something inside him, some long-trained suspicion, some hard knot of expecting to be instrumentalized by every stronger system he entered. Ease a fraction. Not vanish. That would take longer. But ease. And what is it then? He asked. Elira's answer came quietly. Recognition. He looked at her. Of all the words he had expected, that was not one. She did not soften it. She did not explain further. She simply let it stand between them. Recognition. Not sameness. Not equality of suffering. Not shared species, history, power, or loss. Recognition of moral reflex. Of wounds used not as permission, but as restraint. Of the dangerous choice to keep conscience alive when easier systems reward its death. Jonah lowered his eyes briefly. When he looked back up, he said, I don't know what to do with that. You are not required to do anything with it, Elira said. Only not lie about it. He considered that, then nodded once. The stars along the crystal wall had shifted while they spoke, different constellations now, if constellations they were. The tea had gone half cool in his cup. Somewhere beyond the chamber, the ship continued its vast patient motion through contested darkness. At length, Jonah asked, Does Elsin know? He knew instantly the question was imprecise. Elira answered the deeper one anyway. She knows enough to inherit conscience, Elira said. Not enough yet to inherit grief. That seems wise. It seems necessary. Jonah let out a slow breath. Then, because the room now seemed capable of holding such things, he said, My daughter's 8. Elira's gaze rested on him more gently than before. Ava, he blinked. You know her name. I make it my business to know the names of those who shape the moral decisions of my court. That sounds like a terrifying management style. It is an effective one. He laughed once, softly. Then the laugh faded. I've missed years with her, he said. Not because I stopped loving her, because I got too ashamed to stay close. Elira said nothing. He was absurdly grateful. I kept thinking, he continued, staring at the dark tea, that I'd fix enough first, earn enough, become enough, then I'd come back less like a failure. The silence remained, not empty, allowing. And then, Jonah said, I see Elsin in that market, and all I can think is that if Ava were alone somewhere and afraid, I'd want someone to move. When he looked up, Elira was watching him with that old, unbearable steadiness again. Yes, she said, only that. But it was enough, because within it lived no dismissal, no sentimental consolation. Only recognition returned. At last, she moved back to the table and touched the rim of her own cup. You should call your daughter again, she said. Jonah blinked. That sounded suspiciously like advice. It was. I thought sovereigns weren't supposed to interfere in family matters. We interfere in everything. The question is only whether we do it well." He almost smiled again. "Was that you being wise or threatening?" "Yes." For a while after that, they did not speak. The conversation had crossed the point where words improved it only intermittently. Jonah finished the last of the bitter tea. Elira stood by the wall of stars, half in shadow, looking out at distances neither of them could touch from here. At last she said, still facing away, "There will be resistance now." "To me?" "To what your existence within the court reveals." He nodded slowly. "I figured. The Ashen Creed will sharpen. Some houses will hesitate. Others will attempt to claim you rhetorically. A few may genuinely welcome what you represent." She turned slightly. "Do not trust welcome too quickly." "That," Jonah said, "is the most Bastion Reach compatible thing anyone's told me on this ship. It is universally compatible." She came back toward him then, signaling without saying it that the private audience was ending. At the door she paused. "Jonah Mercer." He rose carefully from the chair. "Yes, Majesty?" The title seemed to matter less here, and more. He could not quite explain why. Elira looked at him fully one last time. "You asked how I remember without drowning." "Yes. I do drown," she said at intervals. When she added, "The discipline is in returning with the memory intact and the cruelty refused." The line struck deeper than all the rest, because it was not theory, it was practice, ancient, bloody, costly practice. Jonah bowed his head, not as courtier now, but as one person honoring another's hard-earned truth. When he straightened, Elira had already resumed the sovereign's composure. Not false, not emptied, simply veiled again. The doors opened behind him. Nicera, Kalis, and Mevin waited beyond. He stepped through, the chamber sealed, and Jonah Mercer walked back into the guarded corridors of the Umbralith, carrying something more dangerous than title, more intimate than honor, and harder to explain than politics. The knowledge that the Queen of the Beast Kingdom remained righteous, not because she had escaped becoming terrible, but because every day for 22 centuries she had remembered exactly how easy it would be. That night, alone in his chamber, Jonah did what Elira had told him to do. He called Ava. The quantum relay took only seconds to align. When her face appeared in the screen's blue-lit frame, hair crooked from sleep and one stuffed animal clutched under her arm, his breath caught the same way it had the first time. "Daddy? Hey, sweetheart. You called sooner this time." Something in the simple sentence nearly broke him. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Ava squinted at him. "You look fancier." Jonah laughed helplessly. "That may be the worst thing anyone said to me this week." She brightened. "Good fancy or bad fancy? I honestly haven't decided." They talked about small things first, the safest things. Schoolwork, a story she was reading, a friend who cheated at a learning game and cried when caught. The fact that her stepfather had finally let her hold a solder tool under supervision, and now she wanted to build actual machine things, which Jonah privately suspected meant the galaxy had made a tactical error by giving his child access to curiosity and tools in the same year. Then the conversation slowed. Ava tilted her head. "You're sad," she said. Jonah opened his mouth to deflect, closed it again. Elira's voice, calm as starless water, moved back through him. "Only not lie about it." "A little," he admitted. "Because you miss me?" He smiled, though his throat hurt. "Yeah, I miss you too." The answer came so easily, no punishment in it, no accusation, only truth. Jonah closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, Ava was still there, waiting, trusting him with the answer. "Then I'll keep calling," he said, "even when it's messy, even when I don't feel ready, I think." He breathed in. "I think waiting until I feel less broken might be the dumbest plan I've ever had." Ava considered that gravely. "Dumber than getting shot?" He stared at her, then laughed so suddenly and hard he had to clutch his ribs. "Considerably dumber," he managed. She looked pleased. And far away, in another chamber lit by stars and old restraint, High Matriarch Elira Valathorn stood before a shelf of relics and did not need to ask whether he had understood. Some truths, once spoken rightly, continued working long after the conversation ended. She touched the faded ribbon once, then withdrew her hand. Memory remained. So did grief. So, now, did recognition. And in the long war between conscience and appetite, between remembrance and the simplifications of power, one more ally had entered the field, not born to her blood, not shaped by her kind, but bound now to the same difficult refusal, to remember pain without worshipping cruelty. That, Elira thought, was how kingdoms were saved, not all at once, not cleanly, but one remembered truth at a time.